Buenos dia, Barranquilla. My best Spanish. I'm sorry to inconvenience you all for me to speak in English, but I can't give the presentation in Spanish. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I work in Shell's scenario team. We've been building scenarios for about 50 years, and we build them to understand how the future might roll out. Our scenarios are not predictions of the future. They're not forecasts, and they're not an expression of our company's strategy. They're really exploring what might happen within a plausible framework. So we're not trying to dream here. We're trying to think what might actually happen. What I've just told you is from my lawyer friends there. Thank you. When you're building scenarios, you're generally looking for 2 or 3 key drivers in the world. On this slide, you see 2 drivers that have been around for a bit: technology and climate change. Technology, the breakthroughs, particularly in renewables. Climate change, accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the third, an energy crisis, is something new. We're going through an energy crisis in Europe, nothing like we've seen since the 1970s. And unfortunately, we've forgotten about energy crises and we've become a bit complacent. So our scenarios really focus on what security means and how that might influence the energy system over the next several decades. We're also keeping an eye on 2 key dilemmas, both of which I've heard mentioned in the conference already. So the first is energy access. There are over 2 billion people today who survive on no more than about 35 gigajoules per person per year. Now, that unit might not mean very much until I tell you that most Europeans have a lifestyle that's predicated on about 150 gigajoules a year. And for people who live in North America, it's more like 250 gigajoules a year. So this 2 billion people their lack of energy is impacting their standard of living. Now by 2070, we think that group will have grown to as many as 4 billion people. And for them to have a good life, a decent life, they'll probably need about 100 gigajoules. Why not 150 or more? Because we're becoming more efficient in how we use energy. But still, that one group of people is going to need 6 times as much energy in 50 years' time. So we have a demand side issue. On the right, we have a carbon budget challenge. So the IPCC in 2020 calculated the world had a budget of 500 gigatons of carbon to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. We've now eaten through a good chunk of that, and at the rate we're emitting carbon dioxide, within a decade, we will have breached the carbon budget, which basically means we will exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that's not Shell analysis. You can read that in the newspaper. That's unfortunately the way the world is at the moment. The question is, do we overshoot permanently, or do we overshoot and then come back down? And our scenarios explore that. Now, the final factor we've built in here is looking at regional differences. So historically, our scenarios have said all of the world will do one thing, or all of the world will do another. But what we're actually seeing is energy transition means different things to different people, depending on where they live and what access to energy they have. So we have 4 archetypes, broadly split by region. In Europe, we call it Green Dream. It's an ideological push to move away from oil and gas. I have friends, not working for Shell, I must say, but friends who choose not to fly on holiday. They choose not to eat meat for climate reasons. So there's a movement in Europe, I'm not saying it's everybody, but there's a movement to push much harder away from oil and gas. Now, this is Europe. It's a rich continent. It's had 250 years to benefit from fossil fuels, and now it's choosing to move away. We're not sure everybody else sees it that way. In the United States, Canada, North America, we see innovation as a much more powerful force. So for those who've lived there, you have these large vehicles, trucks, something like the Ford F-150. You can now buy electric versions of those vehicles. So you can have your large truck, but you can drive an electric vehicle. This is innovation wins. Innovation is delivering your lifestyle with a lower carbon footprint. Then we move across to Asia, really dominated by China. China's hugely important to the renewable energy supply chains, metals, processing, manufacturing. We call this Great Wall of Change because it's not only about energy, it's about influence, it's about control, it's about not becoming dependent on oil and gas. And then finally, we have the surfers. These are countries I would call the floating voters, and they will go in a direction that suits them. I think Colombia may be in that archetype. Resources to monetize within the country, but also making choices about technology. Perhaps producing indigenous coal, but at the same time rolling out Chinese solar cells, because that's what's needed in those countries to improve standards of living. So those ingredients we use to create two scenarios. The key difference is how the scenario responds to security. The bottom scenario, Sky 2050, is security through mutual interest. This is where you get security by being together. Now, there's a competitive dynamic there, but it's a cooperative one. It's a teamwork. And in that scenario, we think in a normative form. That means we design the scenario to hit net zero, a very sophisticated goal-seek exercise. We think you can keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade. But on the other side, you have another world driven by a different dynamic in security, and that's security through self-interest. This is a world where people are more cautious to share their intellectual property. They're more careful who they trade with. If you look at the relationship between the United States and China, you get a feel about what archipelagos might mean. Now, in that world, technology doesn't spread as quickly. People are more likely to use their indigenous fossil fuel resources as well as their renewable resources. This is a world where energy transition goes more slowly. Now, there's quite a few charts here. I'm going to talk to the main points of the chart, not the details. What we see is fossil fuels starting to lose market share. They've dominated the energy system for the last 2 centuries. But we think now, in both scenarios, we're starting to see that change. The question is how quickly. In the case of Sky, you need rapid change immediately and consistently. In the case of archipelagos, it goes more slowly. Now, the big change from an energy perspective is electrification. On the right-hand side, you see today about 20% of end-use energy is electrified. So the lights here, the cooling system. But most of you will have driven here today in a car that's an internal combustion engine. Electrification into transport, into other aspects of buildings, cooking, heating, is coming. And again, how fast that goes will depend on how rapidly we can decarbonize. Because if you can electrify an end-use energy requirement, you can feed that with renewables, you can feed it with nuclear, you can feed it with abated fossil fuels. Now, what does this mean for oil demand? In both scenarios, we see oil declining in the long term. These plots go to 2100. I will not be here then. And I will probably have a lot of these different versions between now and 2100. But you see in Sky, the left side, oil demand has to be forced down quickly to reach your climate goals. But in archipelagos, it goes much more slowly. But in both scenarios, the red tranche, OPEC, gains market share. Why do we think OPEC might do that? Because they tend to have cheaper oil and lower carbon oil. And in a world that's using less oil and it's becoming more competitive, those are the two things that will win. Now, in terms of resources, we think further investment is going to be needed. Not all net zero scenarios think that, but we think that natural decline of 4 to 5% per annum will mean we need additional investment in field extensions and new discoveries. But not all countries with major resources will see their resource base fully produced. On the right side are a set of countries that have large resources, but also above ground challenges, political challenges, difficult places to do business. And in the case of your neighbor, Venezuela, the oil is very heavy and very carbon intensive. And we don't see how the world is going to need all of those resources. Now, briefly, on demand, both of our scenarios have a very large number of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are now starting to take off, but typically, rich people in rich markets where there's quite a lot of policy support. So the change is coming, but there are 1.2, 1.3 billion cars on the road today, and it's going to take several decades to fully turn over the fleet. In the case of Sky, we think that can be largely done by 2050. In the case of archipelagos, that process of changing out the fleet will take until the second half of the century. Now, I know these sound a very long way away, but if you're a business that has refineries and tank station networks, these are assets that last 25 years. So you have to think, where is the future going? The other driver of oil and gas demand is petrochemicals. Now, in both scenarios, we see strong demand growth for chemicals, plastic, all of the items you see around you. But it's the composition of the feedstock that's going to change. In a Sky world, oil and gas doesn't actually grow as a feedstock. Instead, it's recycled feedstock on the bottom, and on the top, in the outer years, it's biofuels, or biofeedstocks, and synthetic fuels. So in other words, hydrogen that has been transformed into molecules that you can make plastic from. Both are very expensive. It's wider in the outer years. It's wider in Sky, because you have to believe in policy support. In archipelagos, you see less. You still see recycling, because we see in certain markets, particularly Europe, North America, the drive to recycle, not driven by climate, but driven by nature considerations. Now moving to gas. Gas is an important fuel. It's an important fuel for Shell. So some might ask, why doesn't your line keep going up? Well, the growth of gas has been very strong for several decades. But there are things happening in the energy system now, efficiency, competition from coal still, competition from renewables, and we think that these dynamics are going to slow the growth in gas. In the case of archipelagos, we have a plateau. In the case of Sky, we have decline, because those levers of more renewables and more efficiency, particularly in building heating, perhaps not a big thing in Colombia, but in many parts of the world, a very important source of demand. You have to force gas out of the system if you're going to reach net zero. It's just arithmetic. Now, moving to LNG, another important fuel. LNG is a security fuel. What you've seen in Europe over the last 12 months is the lights stay on. And the only reason the lights have stayed on is LNG. Now, in doing that, the European Union members have probably spent over €500 billion buying LNG. So it's been expensive, but it's kept the lights on. Now, we think in both scenarios, LNG will grow. We see the plants, we see the development funnel, we see the buyers. But in the case of Sky, again, to reach net zero, from somewhere in the mid-2030s, you have to start pushing LNG out of the system. Other scenarios see that. How plausible? It's very challenging, but that's what would need to happen for a net zero scenario in 2050. In an archipelago scenario, the role of LNG will continue for much longer, partly because it's security. When you buy LNG, you can buy from multiple sources. You can store it ready for winter or ready for an emergency. It's an easier fuel to deal with than pipeline natural gas. But also, it can complement renewables. In Europe, the biggest challenge is not summer. Solar is going to be able to keep the lights on, a little bit of cooling. It's winter. And winter is going to be about wind power and heat pumps. But the problem is the wind doesn't always blow. And there is instances in the weather patterns in Europe when you get still weather, a clear sky, and it lasts for 2 weeks. And that's when it's coldest, because the clear sky lets the heat come up. And the only way we will be able to keep warm for the foreseeable future, we'll be able to use gas to plug that gap. Now, I'm not saying in the very long run, we won't be able to move to hydrogen or other energy sources, but with the technology available today, that's what we'll do. Now, moving to wind and solar. This plot shows the global generation of wind and solar in both our scenarios. Now, the units are in terawatt hours, but given I'm speaking to an oil and gas conference, I've put there what 53,000 terawatt hours means. It's equivalent to about 95 million barrels of oil a day equivalent. So put another way, the wind and solar generation we have today is going to have to grow from a small but significant base to an energy supply that's the same size as the global oil industry today. And it would need to happen over the next 30 years. Is that possible? Is a different technology, particularly solar. It's built in a factory, you roll it out, you plug it in. But still, it took the oil industry a century and a half to get to 100 million barrels a day. And I'm saying to you that wind and solar would have to do the same thing in 30 years. It's quite a stretch. Now, in my previous slide, I showed electrification. It's important, but it won't go all the way. We think you can electrify somewhere around half of end use. But there are applications in aviation, shipping, industry, heavy-duty road transport that today we don't know that electrification can deliver the goods. Batteries can improve, and we have improvements in our models, but we're still not sure. So you have two key fuels here that may be able to help. One is second-generation biofuels. And by second generation, I mean biofuels that don't compete with food. Cellulosic-based biofuels. Shell has a joint venture in Brazil where we're looking at this, and we hope to grow it. But due to land use, it's difficult to imagine it scaling to a level of where solar or wind could in terms of energy production. Then we have hydrogen, much talked about. You see that the growth in hydrogen we have, it comes, but it comes a little bit further out than some people's projections. And the reason is, we think that the first thing that will happen with green electricity is it will go into the grid, the power grid, and you will use it to displace power generation from coal or from gas. And only once that's satisfied will you then feed it to make hydrogen. Now, I mentioned land use, and you might think, what is an oil and gas guy here talking about land use? It's extremely important. Our models look at the carbon balance for the energy system and the land system. And what you see is the land system today is a net emitter of CO2, equivalent to about 5 gigatons per annum. And that's due to deforestation, farming practices, etc. To get to net zero, that needs to stop, and it needs to stop this decade. And that is a big challenge. If I look at where I grew up in northern England, on a farm, basically the Romans started chopping our trees down, and it continued for 2,000 years. So it's a very big trend to change. But once you've gone past that, you actually need negative emissions. What do I mean by that? I mean carbon capture and storage, I mean direct air capture, and also sequestration through nature-based solutions. So this is not stopping chopping trees down. This is planting trees. This is looking at agricultural practices and making sure every crop cycle, every annual grazing cycle leaves a little bit more carbon in the ground. We think you're going to need all of this to offset emissions. Now, if you look at the balances, this is the global CO2 from the energy system and from the land system. In the case of Sky, the scenario, by design, drives down to net zero in 2050, and then there are negative emissions with the technologies I mentioned before. In the case of archipelagos, things go more slowly. We see a plateauing of emissions, but the actual decline of emissions comes a little bit later, and that's really to do with the inertia in the energy system. You know, we've had a COVID-induced reduction in travel. Now that has all gone away. I've been in quite a few airports in the last few weeks, and they're all busy. People like what they get from oil and gas, and it's difficult to imagine them giving up on that overnight. So in archipelagos, we allow a little bit more time and then a slower decline. Now finally, what does this mean in terms of temperature? Now, this work is done in collaboration with MIT in the US. It's not for a company like ours to model the climate. We pass over our energy system and land system model. And then with MIT, they have a climate system model, including the atmosphere, land, and sea. And they run through the implication of the energy system. And if you look, the overshoot scenario, the blue line, Sky, indeed goes above 1.5 and then is driven down again. There are other scenarios that look like this. It's an overshoot scenario. But if you don't believe we're going to move as quickly, you don't believe that the negative emissions will be that great, then you're looking at a trend that keeps on increasing and temperature-wise plateaus towards the end of the century at a bit over 2 degrees centigrade. That is my piece. Very happy to take questions off the stage. Thank you very much for listening to me in English, and have a good day.